This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. Space. Everyone knows it is the final frontier, but who can afford to go there? As America, China and Europe look to kickstart a new space race, who will be the winners and the losers? Where is the real money to be made up there? And what does it mean for mankind's innate desire to go where no man has gone before? We'll be talking to one of the world's first commercial astronauts.
I devoted myself to finding a private way to get myself into space.
We'll hear why the European Space Agency is targeting the moon for its next mission to Mars. And find out why mining asteroids could be the solution to the world's mineral shortage. Since the Apollo 11 moon landing 50 years ago, humans have made extraordinary progress in space exploration. Unmanned space probes are already pushing the frontiers back, exploring the universe far beyond our solar system, communicating with Earth from over 11 billion miles away. But what is the next major goal for space exploration? And how soon could space tourism become a reality? At the moment, the commercialization of space is very much a billionaire's playground, with Elon Musk's SpaceX, Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic, and Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin. Well, they're all fighting for the same headlines. Virgin Galactic, by the way, is all about space tourism, claiming you'll be able to head off on a 90-minute journey in 2020 on its Spaceship Two. But the $250,000 price tag is going to put everyone off, except perhaps the super rich. It will be a good while yet before there's anything like a budget space flight. But it's the installation of satellites in space that could provide the fastest financial returns. The reusable Falcon 9 rocket can get satellites into space at a fraction of the current cost. It's planning 30,000 additional Starlink satellites to build the world's largest low-orbit broadband constellation, beaming super-fast internet across the globe. And all that data, of course, is worth billions of dollars. But the Americans have competition. China's iSpace claims it too can have a reusable rocket in space by 2021. But as the world runs out of much-needed minerals, some think the best place to look for them would be mining asteroids as they pass the Earth. And that raises the question of who owns what in space. Well, the UN Outer Space Treaty of 1967 states no nation can claim sovereignty of any celestial body. The Moon Treaty, signed in 1979, modifies that slightly, suggesting states and companies can benefit, provided there is benefit for all mankind. Make of that what you will. But which countries will really benefit? Well, the US, Russia, Europe, Japan and Canada have all been working together for decades through the International Space Station. It's a great example of international cooperation. But with China's increasing interest in space and all those billionaires staking their claims, nobody yet knows the answer to the big question. Who is going to win the new space race? So, what is it like to go into space? I spoke to one of the world's first ever space tourists, gaming billionaire Richard Garriott, who visited the International Space Station in 2008. I began by asking him what ignited his love for exploration.
Well, you know, I think every kid grows up, at least for a period of time, thinking about going to space. But in my case, I had a father who was a NASA astronaut. So in my case, it seemed more plausible. And at about the age of 13, when one of the NASA doctors told me that because I needed glasses, I was not eligible to be a NASA astronaut, I devoted myself to finding a private way to get myself into space. So it took a lot of time, but eventually it worked out. Every aspect of travel in space, or almost every aspect, is phenomenal. You know, even the training is an incredible experience. You know, the day you wake up in the morning, don a spacesuit, go out to a fully fueled rocket that is full of cryogenic fuels with mists, condensation streaming down the sides of it. You get inside and light that up and take a fairly brief 8.5-minute high-speed flight into space, into orbit. Sitting around in space, floating around like Superman 24 hours a day, looking back at the amazing Earth where it just feels like there's a fire hose of information about the reality in which we live just pouring into your mind as you just look out the window. That's really a life-changing experience. And then, of course, the fiery plunge back into the Earth's atmosphere that is punctuated at the end, in the case of on the Russian Soyuz that I was on, with a hard thump, almost an impact on the surface of the Earth as the finale of your trip. Each phase is just an overwhelming experience.
And do you think, you've obviously thought about this an enormous amount, do you think there will be a time in our lifetimes when there is, humans can sustain life in space on a planet?
Unquestionably, I'm sort of counting on it. I'm investing towards it. One of my largest investments is SpaceX, and SpaceX has gone on record saying its entire mission for existence is to help humanity become a multi-planet species. I think when you think about doing things in space, it's always going to take longer than advertised. But I'm not sure that's any different than other industries. I'm a video game maker by trade prior to the space activities, and games always took twice as long as we expected them to take. And it seems like milestones in space exploration are also always hard fought. But we've already gone from peak cost and danger, which was with the space shuttle, where it was about $200 million a seat, plus about 1 out of 70 chance of dying, to nowadays on the non-reusable rockets, the seat prices are still in the tens of millions. But with the reusability that's coming, or we're really not just coming, we're now in the middle of, and especially with the high number of passengers you can put on these even bigger vehicles like Starship, it's believed broadly that the price is now going to come down below $1 million into the single digit, into the hundreds of thousands, and when it does, I think you're going to see a lot more people choosing to experience space and ultimately here in the next decade or two live and work in space or on the surface of another planet.
That's pretty soon. One last question. Was there something you learned when you were in space that you're trying to implement now you're back down here on Earth?
When I was in space and you're sort of taking in all of this that you see below you. You see how the large-scale systems of the Earth interact with each other, whether it's weather systems or erosion by rain, erosion by wind. You see the impact of humanity everywhere, not only roads and dams, but pollution in cities, the clear-cutting of forests. You see, you get a sense of the consumption of humanity, both from the fresh water in the rivers or pumping up fossil water underneath the deserts to grow crops. And when you sit back and think about this, you very quickly realize that the footprint of humanity is everywhere on the surface of this Earth. And the pretty clear, or at least your subjective opinion about the consumption of natural resources is also pretty shocking. And so it makes you, when you get back, you say, look, I need to research this. That was a subjective opinion. What does the data show? And of course, as most people are already aware of, the data also shows some pretty alarming information. And so it really, I think, redoubles your personal commitment to being a better steward of the Earth yourself, as well as kind of evangelizing for these sorts of causes. And so it's really made a substantial change in my personal activities, as well as the things I do with my life.
Taking a short trip to space is already possible. What about living and working beyond the Earth long term? I spoke to Bernhard Hufenbach, the head of the European Space Agency's Strategy and Innovation team.
Well, our exploration program is driven by two nearly philosophical questions. The first question is, what is the place of humans in the universe? We try to understand the origin, evolution of our solar system, and we also try to understand how life evolves in our solar system. And the second question which drives us is whether human one day can live in a sustainable fashion on a different planetary body. All what we're doing is aimed at answering long term those two questions.
And would you say, Bernhard, that Mars, the moon, are the goals you have in sight, the next playing fields?
Well, in our solar system, there are actually 3 destinations we're working on today. Today, we have, since more than 10 years, permanent presence on the International Space Station, a fantastic international project where we do fantastic science for society. That's our first test bed where we learn how humans can actually operate in the harsh environment of space. Moon is the next step. Moon is very important because Moon is a place where we can probably understand how we can use local resources to make our operations more efficient. And then ultimately, Mars is a horizon goal for human exploration within the next 10, 20, 30 years. It's a horizon goal because that's as far as we can plan with our technologies today.
So, in short, you're looking perhaps at going to the moon to use as a stepping stone, a stage en route to Mars. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. Going to Mars is very challenging in terms of operations, science, closing knowledge gap, technologies. Moon is an essential test bed where we can learn how we can operate more independent from Earth, where we can sustain human presence on another planetary body, where we can, as I said earlier, include the use of local resources in our architecture and operational scenarios. We do need to learn a lot of lessons because before we can actually reduce the risk for human mission to Mars, which will come sooner or later after the experience we gain on the moon.
Can you answer the question the song poses? Is there life on Mars?
We don't know today whether there's life on Mars. There are conditions on Mars, in particular paths, which could have led to life emerging. Our missions we are currently implementing and planning, in particular the ExoMars mission, has particularly this goal to look for signs of Mars. We have since 2016 an orbiter orbiting Mars to look for signs of methane, which really is a signal of life on Mars. Later in 2020, we will send our first rover to Mars, which will drill into the surface of Mars and try to find biosignatures of Mars. So we're really trying to answer the question whether life ever existed on Mars, or maybe there's still today some traces of life.
Well, still to come here on the agenda, we'll be asking who's going to regulate what is surely the largest potential new marketplace since the birth of the internet. And we'll also be talking international cooperation in space with the head of the UK's National Space Academy. That's all to come here on the agenda.
CGTN Europe.
And welcome back to the agenda, where we're looking through our own Hubble telescope at the future of space. With me now is the space journalist Sarah Cruddas, Dr. Christoph Beischl, Research Fellow at the London Institute of Space Policy and Law, and Mitch Hunter-Scullion, the CEO and founder of Asteroid Mining Corp. And we'll also be going to Leicester a little later to talk to the director of the UK's National Space Academy, Professor Ojha. But let's come back to London first, and Sarah Cruddas. Sarah, what excites you about space, that you write about it so much?
That's a great question. I think the best way to look at it is us as humans were curious, and it's that curiosity which built the modern world. We explored the world, and you look back at Christopher Columbus sailing to America, and that was almost the, we had this Columbus moment, and that's the same as what we're doing with space travel. So we had government-funded projects, just like Christopher Columbus sailing to America, discovering the new world, helping to create the world we live in today. That was what we saw with Apollo, but now we're entering into a new era in terms of space exploration, which I like to compare with the Mayflower setting sail to America, and it's about private industry and business. And actually, space is no longer a place to go. It's a place to do business. It's an extension of life on Earth, and it's that innate curiosity that we all have, which is helping to drive forward our species into space, but also to bring real benefit back here to Earth. So we're at an exciting cusp in terms of our species, where Earth can almost be thought of as a cave, and we're leaving for the first time. And it's a real start of a new era with benefits that we cannot even begin to imagine.
What occurs to me is watching the developments in space, how quickly we've gone from science fiction to space reality.
Well, that's true. I think science fiction should actually be renamed science prediction, because all the things, it's true though, all the things you can imagine eventually come true. Look at Da Vinci with helicopters, and we eventually got those. And then all the things you can't imagine, they come true also. And you look at someone born at the start of the, in the 1900s, and what they saw within their lifetime, the birth of flight, human beings going into space, setting foot on the moon, and then the era of cyberspace at the end of that century. And now we look to this century and we can't even begin to imagine what is to come. And that's what's so incredible about space. Within this, within the next few decades, we'll answer the question, are we alone? We will eventually see, hopefully in the next decade, humans returning to the moon, but this time for good, not just flags and footprints. Within this century, we'll see humans setting foot on Mars, and we'll also see, most importantly of all, untold benefits back here on Earth, because the real reason we go into space is to improve the quality of life for everybody on this planet.
As well as trying to improve that quality of life on the planet, of course, we are trying to commercialize space as well. And when you commercialize space, Dr. Beischl, that means you need regulation and you need laws. A lot of people will be very surprised that there is such a thing as space law.
Yes, so space law, we have a set of international space law, which is at the center is the Outer Space Treaty from 1967, currently signed by over 100 countries, including the US, Russia, China, every major spacefaring nation. And there are some minor agreements that link to the treaty that have been also signed on the international level. Then there's quite a substantial section of national space legislation, usually coherent to what the Outer Space Treaty sets out as basic principles. And an interesting thing is there are already commercial activities going on based on space law for decades, for example, telecommunications.
Which is the big one.
Yes, that's the moneymaker, to be fair. And currently we see a huge interest also in additional commercialization of remote sensing data, of commercial mining activities. So the regulations are to a certain degree missing the specialized regulations for these kind of activities.
Mitch, Hunter-Scullion, we're talking about satellites, commercial technology in space, but you're interested in getting the pit ponies up there with hard hats and pit props because you're mining for asteroids. Now, excuse my ignorance, but tell me what that involves.
Well, there are 18,000 near-Earth asteroids and over 4 million main belt asteroids in our solar system, and of those approximately 4% are metallic asteroids, and of those 4%, a quarter, so about 1% of total asteroids are high platinum-bearing asteroids. So they're the ones which we have identified as being potentially viable candidates for mining, and obviously we need metals on this planet, we need resources. Platinum is a perfect example because we only mine 200 tonnes of platinum per year, purely due to the limitations on Earth. But in space, you do not have these same limitations. For example, an average Earth mine can contain 15 parts per million of platinum, whereas some meteoric samples have shown up to 300 parts per million of platinum. So there is potentially orders of magnitude higher platinum to be found within an asteroid compared to on the Earth. And obviously within an asteroid you're not having to dig deep into the crust of a planetary body. It can be found at surface level.
It's not just minerals though, is it? It's water as well.
You have to first identify which asteroids are potentially valuable and where they are. And unless you can have some spectral classification of asteroids, which currently is very scant, then you're in a position when it's very difficult to even discover which asteroids would be valuable candidates for mining. So what we're doing is we're developing the Asteroid Prospecting Satellite 1, which will go up into a low Earth orbit and will simply just look out into the solar system to identify viable candidates for asteroid mining.
And which countries are taking the lead in legal space mining?
Oh, absolutely Luxembourg. Luxembourg is the global pioneer for space resources law. Yeah, tiny Luxembourg. But they are a head and shoulders above anyone else when it comes to sort of developing space resources from a national legal perspective. So they have the Space Resources.lu initiative, and the recently formed Luxembourg Space Agency has made space resources one of their main priorities as an agency.
The big issue in this regard is it legal? And here we have different interpretations, and a strict interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty says no.
But there's also maritime law which governs where we go in space as well. So if you can get there and you can mine those resources, technically that is legal as well.
Okay, I don't want to go into too many legal details here. Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty says the national appropriation by sovereignty, claim of use, and occupation, and by any other means is prohibited.
Well,
but
how do you enforce that? How do you enforce that?
Let me just add one thing to, and the maritime law is focusing on just on sovereignty. It doesn't focus on appropriation. And the second thing is, it sets out the freedom for fishing, for example. The Outer Space Treaty doesn't set out like a freedom for resource exploitation, and fishing is a renewable resource.
Well, you knew soon as the lawyers were involved, there would be some kind of argument always. But let's go to something less contentious and go to Leicester and pick up with Professor Anu Ojha from the National Space Academy. Dr. Ojha, why do we need a National Space Academy?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Stephen. But to answer it, if you'll forgive the essay answer, I want to take a step back, because when people ask me, what do you mean by space science? I say it's three simple parts. There's looking out there, astronomy, going out there, exploration, and the part that you've been talking about that so many people overlook, the satellites that are looking back here at Earth, because they are giving us the services that are absolutely fundamental to our 21st century way of life. Global telecommunications, increasingly internet satellite provision. And this is the part of the space sector that really makes money. It's $400 billion a year. That's the figure that we're approaching for 2019. It underpins nearly 20% of our global GDP when you look at these services. And as a sector, it's growing. Now, that's a tremendous success story, but we've got a real challenge, because if we want to keep growing the space sector in this way, we need thousands or tens of thousands of new entrants coming in. That's just in the United Kingdom. And so the program that I lead, the National Space Academy program, is a skills development program working with sort of secondary level and university students and their teachers, not only to teach them more about space science, but to enable them to navigate their way successfully into a sustainable career path.
Is there a lot of room for cooperation with other countries?
Absolutely. I mean, as a national programme, we're supported by the United Kingdom Space Agency, by UK government, and a number of other entities from industry and academia. But we work internationally. We've had a number of experiments on the International Space Station, and critically for us, and what's really interesting, is the work that we've been doing with China. I'm one of the leaders of the UK's strategic programme of space science collaboration with China. About 4 years ago, China's government and China's National Space Administration were really interested in what we'd learnt in our methodologies for space education, began to partner with us, and we've seen a suite of activities now that's been growing and growing and growing in China. And we see that this focus on education can not only help try to meet our skills requirements, it can build platforms for greater collaboration, greater scientific research as well. So for the National Space Academy, our collaborative programs with China, in other countries, in developing countries, and of course with the European Space Agency are major foci for us.
Lastly, Professor, you talk about cooperation. In the race to space, you're talking about collaboration, cooperation, not competition?
In the end, you get a mixture of both. But what I'd like to point out is one of my favourite pictures that I use in my presentations. And it's a picture from 1997. And it's the US Space Shuttle Atlantis docking with the Soviet-era Mir space station. And that really was the beginning of the collaboration that led to the International Space Station. Now, wind back 10 years before that picture was taken to 1987. If you'd have told me when I was an undergraduate that I would see a US space shuttle docking with a Soviet-era space station, I'd have said that's impossible. So what's interesting in terms of competition and collaboration is that we're in a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape, and there are new opportunities for collaboration. There will be competition, of course, and sometimes competition can be a great accelerator, but it's the collaborative framework of space science progress that we need to build on. And there is a lot more international collaboration than many people realise. So collaboration is the key for going forwards. And I think that the possibilities that we have from the discussion that I've been listening into, you know, I wouldn't say the sky is the limit, it's a bit of a cliche, but there is tremendous scope for the future and challenges as well.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm never short of a cliche myself, but the sky's the limit. Sarah Cruddas, starting with you, final thoughts. I mean, what about my question, very quickly, if you will, about so much collaboration between countries, and we're talking about Britain, UK and China, but there must be competition for the big prize in space. What would that be?
Well, again, the sky is no longer the limit, actually, because, space is limitless, so to speak. In terms of just quickly on collaboration, think about the International Space Station. Nations which might not necessarily get on Earth, for example, the US and Russia working together in space. Actually, the International Space Station should really have a Nobel Peace Prize in terms of what it's able to do in uniting nations. The competition is from business. Where there's money to be made, space has the potential to be a $1 trillion industry. The first trillionaire will potentially come from data utilization back on Earth. So the prize is a financial prize, whether you like it or not. It's economics which drives forward innovation. So in terms of the next step, well, there's multiple next steps. So let's stop thinking about the space race, about two superpowers going for the moon, and think about the idea of a Wild West. So there's first human being on Mars, the first woman on the moon, first person to, or first country to potentially collaborate to answer that question, are we alone in the universe? But if there's one competition, that's a financial incentive. It's utilising space-based data. Data's king when it comes to space.
You're never alone with a lawyer, Dr. Beischl. So lots of room for new space laws?
Yes and no. I mean, what we have right now on the international level already covers a lot. At the same time, what we need now is more specialized laws for the different activities that people want to engage in. And we have made strides in this regard. So there's a lot of discussion, especially also on the legal mining side. There are workshops taking place with academics and so on to establish a foundation on which to build. Well, if we get there, that's the question. Cooperation will be the key, because we need international regulations. And for this, we need the states to get together and find a solution. The big problem is, compared to the 1960s, where we had two superpowers who can lead, we now have a multitude of voices.
And Mitch, the big prize in space for your mining company?
The first person to own an asteroid will probably be one of the first billionaires on this planet. I do agree with Sarah when she talks about how data utilisation is the key to being able to mine asteroids, though, or just to do anything in space, because who owns the data is ultimately the person who has the most power. And if you have that data, then you can then action on that data to then look at which ones would be the most valuable asteroids, the most valuable assets in space. I think over the next sort of 3 to 5 years, we will see that information and that data being much more widespread and commercialised. I think that will definitely be the first step towards developing a space mining industry.
And thanks to all of you for joining me here on The Agenda. Now, space really did used to be the last frontier, but no longer science fiction, as we know, is rapidly becoming science fact as the billionaires and national space programs buy into the solar system. Down here on Earth, Virgin Galactic shares were traded for the first time, and on the first day became a $1 billion space tourism company. For the Virgin Space Cadets of Richard Branson, it was a case of mission accomplished, as shares in Virgin Galactic rocketed 10% on their market debut. Normally, on Earth anyway, where there is tourism, there is litter, rubbish left behind. But in space, it's been the other way around. Even before the billionaires and countries started to invest in intergalactic tourism, human debris, junk, space rubbish, and mechanical detritus were already littering the solar system. 50 years after the moon landing, there are still no clear rules or laws for dealing with man-made junk, and adding to it is weapons testing up there aimed at destroying satellites and creating thousands of pieces of yet more space junk. Earthbound lawyers need to recognize there is a huge value in keeping space safe to innovate and explore. And there are almost 2,000 active satellites orbiting the Earth at the moment. That number could soon rocket to 26,000. Eventually, not only will intellectual property lawyers be needed in space, but there's likely to be a role for a new space sheriff as well. Next week on The Agenda, it's being called the worst drugs crisis in history. We'll be talking about the global opioid epidemic. Don't forget, for more Agenda content, you can visit our website or you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.